Today we're going to take a look at determining the number of days between two dates. Now this is going to be done with the date object. I'm not going to take the time to explain the date object in detail, but we will look at a few things that will allow us to determine the number of days. This same technique you can use to determine minutes, hours, seconds, whatever it is you want to determine between two sets of dates and or times. Now, something that's important to know about the date object in solving this problem is that the date is expressed as a number or a string. Now, if the date is expressed as a string, we understand that. It looks like the kind of date format we're used to. However, when it's expressed as a number, you may wonder, what does this number represent? Well, it simply represents a number in milliseconds. And that milliseconds is actually the number of milliseconds that have passed since the start date, which was January 1st, 1970, which I'll show in just a second. It's also important to know that the date object consists of multiple methods. One of the great sources for seeing all the methods associated with the date object is W3 Schools. You can see there are a number of methods listed here which you can take a look at and see how you can use when you're dealing with the date object. Finally, I said there is a start date and time for the date object. The 0 time is equal to January 1st, 1970 with the clock set at 000. That is when milliseconds started counting. And so when the date object is expressed in numbers, it is the number of milliseconds since this value. Now, if you use a date prior to January 1st, the number is expressed as a negative number. And so it starts counting the other direction as a larger and larger negative number the farther you get away from January 1st, 1970. And that's an important thing to remember if the date you are using falls before January 1st, 1970. Okay, before we look at an actual example, let me open up the JavaScript console just to illustrate some of these points which were made about the date object. First, I'm going to create an original date and set it equal to January 1st, 1970 at 12 a.m. I'm going to press return. Now let me just display that value, and here's what we get. This is the date object expressed as a string. January 1st, 1970, 000. But notice the timestamp here, Mountain Standard Time. So that's actually going to be 7 hours different than UTC time, which is what is used as the actual starting point. Now, how do I know that? Well, it's because of one of the methods that's associated with the date object, and that is the getTime method. Basically, what the getTime method does is simply express the date in milliseconds. And so, if I express this date in milliseconds, you might expect, well, it should show 0. Well, it doesn't. It shows 25,200,000. Which, if you do the math, is exactly 7 hours. And so, as indicated here, Mountain Standard Time is 7 hours difference than UTC. Or Greenwich Mean Time, as indicated here. All right, one more example. I'm going to create a new date object for December 31st, 1969. So this should be before the start time and date. Now, if we display that, with get time, you can see that it is a negative number. So anything before that 0 hour is expressed in negative numbers. All right, I'm going to jump to Sublime now, and we'll take a look at our example of determining the number of days between two dates. All right, here's our HTML page I was showing. Here's a JavaScript file attached to it. So let's first do this. I simply want to determine the number of days since the start of the year. So I'm going to declare several variables. The first variable I'm going to set to new date and define it as January 1, 2016. Now I need to declare a few other variables as well. One is the end date. And I'm just going to use the date for today. So if you indicate new date without anything in the parentheses, it will return the current date and time. I'm going to create a variable for the difference between those two. And then I'm going to create a variable called days. This is going to be the value that we have to divide the milliseconds by to determine the number of days. So if you have something in milliseconds, you'll need to divide it by 1,000 to get the number of seconds. Then you will need to divide it by 60 to get the number of minutes. Then you will need to divide it by 60 again to get the number of hours. And then you'll need to divide it by 24 to get the number of days. So if I multiply all those numbers together and put it in this variable, I can use that as my value to divide by. Now obviously if you're concerned about different values other than day, such as hours or minutes, then you would adjust accordingly. Now determining the number of days between two date values is pretty simple. You simply get the difference of those two values, the end date minus the start date. Then all I need to do now is log to the console the difference divided by days. But I'm going to use the math object to round that down, not really round it, but eliminate the decimal place after the value, because I really only want to see the days. I don't want to see a portion of a day, how much of today has passed. That's basically what that will tell me, the part that's beyond the decimal point. So diff divided by days. And then I'll just concatenate a string here. All right. Let's go ahead and save that. I'm going to jump out to the page again and refresh. So 305 days have passed since the start of the year. It's November 1st right now. And some of you might be thinking, well, wait, that's one day off. Actually, 2016 was a leap year. So we had February 29th this year. So that's why there's 305. It doesn't count all of today, because today's not over yet. So that's, as I mentioned, is the part that would be beyond the decimal point if I hadn't have used math.floor. All right, one more example. Okay, I looked this date up just a few moments ago. I want to do a date that's prior to the start date. And so I looked up the day that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And that happened before 1970. So let's use that date. That will give us a negative number to work with. The date Neil Armstrong walked on the moon was July 20th, 1969. So that's definitely before 1970 and will give us a negative number. The rest of these variables stay the same. Now down here, this formula will stay the same as well. Think about it for just a second. If we take the end value, which is today's date, that is a positive number in milliseconds, and then we subtract a negative number in milliseconds, it's going to add that to this value, so it will get larger. And so that works with what we're trying to do. So the same formula is going to work because any value before 1970 is expressed as a negative number. So we can use that same formula. We'll use math.floor again. Let me just change what I'm logging to the console here. Well, change it right there. All right, let's save that. Jump out and refresh. So 17,271 days have passed since Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. If you want to know how many years that was, you divide that by 365. I happen to have a calculator on me, so let me do that really quick. 17,271 divided by 365 equals approximately 47.31. And so that works out about right. Obviously, some years have more than 365 and so on. But that just allows us to check and make sure it's working for us. Now, one last thing I want to mention before I finish this video. In some cases, you may want to convert the time to UTC in order to get the most accurate results. If you're checking like hours, something to that extent, then you may want to do that. Especially if you're in an area where there is daylight savings time. Now, to do that, you can use the get time zone offset. This will return the difference between your local time and the UTC time. And then you can make that adjustment in your formula before you then subtract the numbers. So that's only if you're concerned that you may not take into account something that happened with the time, such as daylight savings time, and you really want accurate hours or minutes or something like that. All right, hopefully you found that helpful. If so, like the video, subscribe to our channel. We have new videos every week. And for further resources, you can visit allthingsjavascript.com.